Hi folks, John Dunn here, RPG freelancer, publisher behind Meliorvia, and I'm up here at Immortals with
the notorious, yours truly. Why are we in a snowfall today? Why is it chilly in here?
Well, you know, it's Cleveland, so it's going to be snowing until at least June, right? I mean, that's what happens. But more specifically, in this case, we're talking about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Oh, back at
published
Warhammer.
By Cubicle 7. Yes, we are back at Warhammer. This is very different from the Warhammer we talked about previously, though. We talked about Soulbound once before, and that is set in the current setting for the Warhammer Fantasy Battles game, which Age of Mortals, I believe. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is set in the old world, so that is the setting that was used for Warhammer Fantasy from when GW started up until, I don't know, about 5 years ago when they revamped the whole world. So this is actually the 4th edition of the game. It's published by Cubicle 7. First edition came out way back in 1986 when Games Workshop published that. Then there was a 2nd edition in 2004 from Black Industries and a 3rd edition in 2009 from Fantasy Flight Games. As I mentioned, Soulbound is also available from Cubicle 7. If you want to play in the current setting for Warhammer, you want that game. If you're more interested in the older edition, older setting, you want this game. Both currently available. They do both use very different game systems to go with the very different game settings. One other thing I wanted to give a shout out to when we're talking about this is the Enemy Within campaign. This is a campaign that was written for Warhammer Fantasy. It's kind of an iconic campaign. First published in the 80s, it's gone through quite a few different iterations since then. It is currently available for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. That's the Enemy Within campaign. It's a 5-part campaign. There's a lot of stuff going on there. And it's really considered one of the great role-playing game campaigns that's ever been produced in the industry. And this is the game system that you want to use to play that. So let's talk about that system and that setting a little bit. It's in the old world of Warhammer Fantasy. This book starts off with character creation, like a whole lot of RPG books do. And the first thing you're going to do when you're making up a character is you're going to pick your species. For this book, your options are human, halfling, dwarf, high elf, and wood elf. There are a lot of other different species in the setting. There are other source books available that offer some of those, but for this core book, those are your options available. Once you get into your species, then the next step is picking your class. And when they talk about class, they don't mean like a D&D class as much as they mean a social class. And then you have a career within that. So D&D, there's maybe a dozen core character classes. In Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there are 64 different classes.
64?
Yeah.
How long does that even take to come across? Like,
right.
When you're
it takes a while just to read through the list, never mind the individual descriptions of those different careers that tie into the different social classes.
So I'm guessing you spend like one session just doing that, right?
I mean, kind of, yeah. Usually most games, I like to spend a session doing character creation, and I think that's particularly relevant here. And I think that's also going to tie into doing it cooperatively to make sure you've got a group of characters that kind of fit together. When you've got that many classes, they're not all obvious adventurer classes. I mean, there are some, right? There's a knight, there's a warrior priest. These are obvious adventurers that are going to go out and, you know, for the glory of the empire, do cool stuff. But then you've also got a villager as a career. So, you know, you might be a candlestick maker or a bread maker. And then there's an archetypical one that's been around through every edition of this. That is the rat catcher.
Don't tell me he just catches rats.
That is exactly what the rat catcher does. Now, that is a little more complicated than it might be in the world everybody lives in, because there are Skaven, right? So Skaven are rat men. So yeah, that adds a level of complexity to the rat catcher career, but that's not really their primary focus.
Rat men.
Yes. Skaven are kind of an iconic part of Warhammer Fantasy.
They didn't have any mouse traps or rat traps back then, did they?
Oh, well, you know, they had something. Once you get through picking your species and your class and your career, then you're going to get into attributes. The attributes are very familiar to anybody that's played Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Basically that same stat line. After that, you get into skills and talents and trappings, and those are kind of going to dictate most of your starting gear. And then more routine things like your character's name, appearance, your ambition. And then you get into connecting the different characters together, which is a big part of, why they're adventuring together, and the backgrounds. And then there's some options for advancement. Core mechanic for the game is percentile. So you're going to take a skill and an attribute, add them together, and try and roll under that on a 100-sided die. And so that's pretty familiar to people that have played a lot of different types of games, including a lot of the Warhammer 40k roleplay stuff uses a very similar mechanic to this. In between adventures, there's a section that talks about endeavors, and these are things that your characters might do to develop in different ways between their adventures, and not just like improving their skills and their attributes, but also improving their relationships with different organizations. There's a whole section past that on religion. It's into the different deities of the world, the different cults that are associated with them, and then prayers and blessings and miracles that those deities might use to grant favor upon the characters, often within the context of an adventure. Then there's a magic section for the characters that have access to that, where you've got your spells, you've got Keller magic and witch magic and dark magic, and of course chaos magic, that being an iconic part of Warhammer. After that, there's a game master section that covers just a lot of the basic GM advice, how to design encounters, how to design adventures, how to award experience. Then you have a chapter that talks about Reichland, which is a big part of the Warhammer fantasy world and is intended as your focal point, at least initially, for campaigns in this. Of course, there are source books out there that offer coverage on other areas. After that, you get into money and equipment and, things your character's going to acquire over the course of the adventures, and a bestiary. End of the day, this is a full color book. It's got some great looking artwork like that piece behind me. There is a lot of very rich coverage presenting the world and the different characters and beings within it. And it is a 352-page book. Retails for $60 from Cubicle 7. Yeah, it's a slick piece. If you like the grim, gritty world of Warhammer Fantasy where your characters are fighting every step of the way and in constant risk of death, this is a fantastic system and setting for exploring those kinds of worlds.
Not to mention there's flintlock pistols, everybody.
Absolutely. Big part of the setting for the Soldiers of the Empire and the Dwarves as well. Till next time, thanks for giving a listen. Stop in at Immortals. We've got this on the shelf, or immortalsinc.com. Good gaming, folks.
Immortalsinc.com. Peace out, guys.